Yep, all good.
Good. Okay, awesome. All right, so welcome everybody. Thank you so much for having me here. My name is Heath Adams, and I'm going to be talking about pentest story time. So these are my favorite hacks from the past year or so. So quick, who am I? I am a husband. I'm a hacker, military veteran. Like to play video games when I get the time to. Sports fan, and I have way too many animals. I am a former accountant that fell in love with IT and cybersecurity and just kind of transitioned my way into becoming a hacker. From day to day, I am the CEO and founder of a company called TCM Security. We are a pen test focused company, though we do some security consulting in traditional sense as well. Um, I also go by the Cyber Mentor on social media. So if you are interested in learning about ethical hacking, or you just want to, shoot me a follow, pretty much Twitch, YouTube, Twitter, all the same. The Cyber Mentor. Um, as mentioned by Jeff, which I appreciate, the Academy does have courses. We've got about 200,000 students there, 170 almost, I think, 170,000 on Udemy and on YouTube as well. So we're fairly big on in the training space, as well as doing ethical hacking. So those are my links in my social media. And briefly, we're going to talk about why this talk. So I actually see a bunch of names in the audience that I'm familiar with, including a former coworker. Shout out to JR. So this talk is for red teamers, also for blue teamers, and for the rest. I'm actually going to keep this talk fairly high level. There's going to be some technical concepts, and I'm going to try to introduce them and explain them like you're five. But this talk is for red teamers who are interested in perhaps learning some new techniques or attacks. For any of you on the defensive side that want to know kind of what we're doing and what we're looking for when we're going through engagements. And then for the rest of you that just kind of are interested in how we're hacking networks. So primarily, most of this talk is going to be about internal assessments because they're my favorite. They're always kind of like putting puzzles together. And when we talk about internal assessments, we're talking about inside of a network. So you can imagine that we dropped a machine off, or we were able to exploit an employee and gain access to the internal network, but we're looking at it from inside the network, with the exception of the first story. We're going to talk about it externally as well. All right, so the first story is a little bit outside of a year. It's actually a little bit about 2 years old. And this is called No MFA, Thanks. So this engagement started as an external that led to an internal assessment. And with that, we were asked to basically try to exploit their external, see if we can break in from the outside, meaning that could be anybody from anywhere, and see if we can breach the perimeter. So from there, what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to break in, and then we're going to try to navigate from inside the network, and try to make sure that we can, or try to reach the domain controller if we can. So with that, when we talk about external assessments and internal assessments, I like to compare them to household security. If you think about a house, on the external of your house, or the outside of your house, if you're trying to protect it, you probably have locks, you probably have a dog, or you could have a dog, you could have like floodlights or lighting, you could have security cameras, an alarm system. There's a lot of things going on that, could protect you. Same thing on the external. I feel like there's a lot of patching done. Usually we don't just go find remote code execution. We don't find a glaring vulnerability unless it's something that's like relatively new, or just happenstance, but it's very, very rare. And the chances are, if we found that vulnerability and it's easy to execute vulnerability, that somebody else has already found it too. So with that being said, typically we use a lot of brute force techniques, or a lot of password guessing techniques, and a lot of information gathering and OSINT to actually try to find our way into a network. So we're going to go ahead and look at that here. So the first thing we're going to talk about is a technique called credential stuffing. So basically what we're doing is we're taking stolen credentials. So you can think of any of the big data breaches that have happened. Those credentials eventually make their way out to the public web. You'll have usernames, you'll have passwords, you'll have IP addresses, home addresses, all sorts of unique information that you can kind of use to to pinpoint information to people. But for basic terms here, let's just say that in this example, you see that stolen credentials of Joe. Say we looked up Joe in a database and we see Joe's passwords ABC123. We're going to go ahead and try to use credential stuffing and log into anything that might be out there that has a login for the client. So basically, we're taking known usernames and credentials. And this is useful in a few ways. So I'm going to show you that here. So this is utilizing a tool that I actually wrote called breach parse. What this does is looks through an offline database and goes through and tries to find breached username and credentials. So then here we're looking at Tesla as an example. Tesla has a public bug bounty program, so showing off this information is not too big of a deal. Basically, what we would be doing is trying to look through these lists. Now, the offline lists are okay. There are also websites like Dhashed and some other websites similar to that allow you to pay for a service, and you can actually utilize their databases, which are kept more up to date with the data breaches, and we use those during engagements. So with a data breach and with these kind of credentials, when we're looking them up, we can see a lot of different information. So I've kind of tried to color code this, but we see usernames and passwords. And we also see username patterns. Tesla's not the best example, but typically we can find username patterns. There's other tools for this as well. But we're seeing a lot of the first dot last type pattern. If you see in the orange, even anywhere else, you're seeing a lot of first dot last. So my hunch would be if I'm looking at, looks like the Brazilian Tesla, there I would be assuming that their usernames are first name dot last name. Where we see at tesla.com, you're seeing a lot of just kind of first names. I'm guessing as they've grown as a company, they've gone away from that. The other thing that you can see too, though, is you can see the password patterns / repeat offenders. We could see where passwords are very similar. Like I highlighted the shark at Tesla. You see that password is pretty much the same, just using some capitalization in between. So I can easily write a script for that and just guess that password if I need to. So we're looking for any sort of formatting, because then we can go on LinkedIn, we can go anywhere else, gather information. And if I know it's first dot last or first initial last name, now I'm starting to compile usernames as well. And this is all information gathering and that we can lead to later attacks. So with that being said, I used breach parse. I did some credential gathering. I took that and I started spraying it around to all of their logins. Utilizing credential stuffing, I was actually able to find a valid account for an old Lotus Note server. This was actually not even in commission. It was something that they were planning on decommissioning, but what this server had was a nice exploit if you were authenticated. So as long as you were able to log in with any user, you can dump out all the users in the database, and you can get their hashes and their passwords too. So now I went from having maybe 400 or 500 users that I had from a database from breach credentials to well over 1,000 users and usernames with known good passwords that didn't exist anywhere else. So I have a huge username list, huge password list. So I took that information and I tried to spray that around to the logical places. I tried to put it into email. I tried to put it into VPN. I tried to see if anything worked anywhere. Unfortunately, it didn't work. So what we did instead here is we did something called password spraying. So we can, with Outlook, especially Exchange, Office 365 is getting better as it matures. But especially with like on-premise Exchange, which this was, we can use basic tools such as Metasploit to spray Exchange, and it tells us a couple things. There's a time-based username enumeration. So basically, we could supply it a username, and if it's valid, it'll respond in a different time than if it's invalid. So the tool can actually detect that and say, hey, this username's good, this username's not good, and then you have a clean list where you can actually just spray off of, and you don't have to waste time spraying invalid usernames. So we're able to do username enumeration. We're also able to get the domain name off of this because that's provided by the tool as well and given to us by Outlook as a service. So from there, basically we do password spraying. So that's more of like a password guessing here, especially if you have a user database, which we were spraying over 1,000 names. It's highly likely that we're going to get in if there's a weak password policy. So we were spraying things like summer 2018, winter 2018, as this was a couple of years ago. So maybe like winter 2019. and just spraying that to see if we can get in. Other things are simple, like password one, the company name with a one exclamation. You just kind of try to guess the policy or try to find the policy online and try to adhere to that in the most simple and basic ways possible. So a weak password often leads to easy wins for us. And we utilized that once we logged in. We were able to find a username to log in with. We utilized that and took that over to the VPN, tried to log into the VPN. They had no multi-factor authentication on either Outlook or the VPN, so we were able to log right into their network. This is a fairly common scenario, but the story does take a nice turn. So I call up the IT manager, and I said, hey, I managed to breach your external network and gain access to your VPN. He said, okay, what level user are you? And I said, well, I'm a low level user right now. And his response to me was, oh, that's it? I'm not too worried. What can you even really do with a low level account? And we were on the phone. He couldn't see my face, but if he could see my face, that was the face that I was making. So being challenged as I was, I decided that we're going to take this guy down. So when it came to the internal assessment, imagine now we're inside the network. We've achieved some access, and we're going to go ahead and try to attack that. So what we're going to do is one of the first and most common things that we try as attackers from a pen tester perspective is what's known as LLM&R poisoning. So LLM&R, if you think about it, it is used to identify hosts when DNS fails to do so. And I have a nice little graphic I'm going to show you here in a second. This is also previously known as MBTNS. So there is a key flaw to this that reveals a username and a NTLM v2 hash that we can take offline and try to crack. We can also try to relay it. There's a lot of fun stuff that we can do with this, and I'm going to show you here very soon. So here is an example of what LLM&R poisoning looks like from a very high level. So if we have LLM&R poisoning, we are sitting in the man in the middle position, okay? And we have something like, I like to use a invalid share. So say a user goes out and they try to go to a share called hack me, but instead they type in hack M. And this is just one example. LLM&R is flying all over the network all the time. So it's just one of those things that this is just as a broad example. Don't get too hung up on the invalid share. But what happens is the server doesn't know what HackM is as a destination. So instead, a broadcast message goes out on the network and it says, does anybody know how to connect to this? And as a hacker sitting in the middle, we say, yes, I do. Go ahead and send me your hash and I'll connect you. Okay, so what they do is they send over their NTLM v2 hash. If that hash is weak, then guess what? We get to own them. We get to at least crack the password and utilize that to move on forward. So we do a little man-in-the-middle poisoning, a little bit of hash cracking, and the story gets better because the first hash that we grabbed and the first hash that we cracked was no other than the IT manager that told us what can you do. And to make the story even a little bit better, the IT manager was using his first name and one as a password. So that's a domain admin challenging you with low-level user. Shouldn't probably use their first name and a one as a password, but it made the story that much better that we were able to own him, then log into the domain controller with his credentials and own the environment. So there is a common theme here. I'm just going to click through these for time's sake, but a big theme here is passwords. So passwords are really big. If I had one advice to give clients, it would be that your password policy is probably one of the most important factors. Weak passwords are going to let people in all day. There's always, of course, the social engineering aspect and the weak employee or weak training aspect, but a weak password, you're just asking for trouble. So here with the lessons learned, from a defensive side, multi-factor would have stopped us, especially on the VPN, but it would have stopped us as well in Outlook. I see a lot of times where mail servers don't have MFA, then we're able to get credentials there. We're able to send VPN MFA to ourselves or do something along those lines, or even find sensitive data within the emails. So MFA is super, super important. Password complexity is important. The longer your password, the better. So, if you can make it 16, 20, 30 characters, that's definitely better than having an 8-character password. Avoid using emails as usernames if you can. I've seen some companies move to like user IDs, and that really works out well. User training works well as well. And of course, don't taunt your pen tester. So moving on to story number 2. So this is about IPv6, and it's called IPv6 for the win. So when we're in networks, inside networks, by default, we all know about IPv4. And when we have our domain controller, we have our DNS server, we are listening for IPv4 traffic for DNS, but nobody's really thinking about IPv6. It's something that has been around for a while, kind of just lies dormant. I think back all the way going to Vista, it even would prefer to have a DNS connection over IPv6. So what's happening is all the time, if you look over like a Wireshark connection, all the time, there's always requests going out. Hey, who's my DNS server for IPv6? And this is always going out. And if there's nothing going on IPv6, we can act like a DNS server, sit man in the middle, and then intercept requests and use those to log in. And this one is a pretty wicked vulnerability that it's quote unquote, it's abusing a feature of Windows. So it's nothing really to patch, and we'll talk about that here soon. But we can basically use a tool called man in the middle 6. All we have to do here is you can see we're specifying the domain. So here is marvel.local. This is just in a test environment. You can see marvel.local, we're specifying this. And then we're also using another tool over here. So this tool is called NTLM Relay X. We're specifying that we're over IPv6. We're pointing to the domain controller because this is where our LDAP S is occurring. And we're going to do LDAP relaying here. And I'm going to show you what all that means in a second. We're setting up a fake WPAD, and we're setting up a loot folder as well. And then this is kind of what happens. So basically what we're doing, we're sitting man in the middle like this. We're waiting for events to occur. We're sitting here waiting for to act and reply to any sort of these DNS queries. So what happens, let's kind of go through this. We'll say a non-admin user event occurs. And when I say an event, it could be a lot of different things, but one way to trigger this, especially in a lab environment, is just logging in. So if you reboot your computer and you just go log in, this will trigger an event. So imagine sitting in an office space at 8 o'clock in the morning or 9 o'clock in the morning, and you've got man in the middle 6 running with a relay set up to the domain controller. All you got to do is wait for the right login. So what happens here is this is a non-admin user. So what we have is we have an authentication. It was able to authenticate to LDAP because it's still a user within the environment. So we're taking the credentials that we see and we're passing them on. We're saying, hey, I am this person. Go ahead and just trust me. And it says, okay, I trust you. And what happens is it prints out, or at least will store for us some information that can be dumped. And this is without any exploit, without any access, anything. We get all the domain computers, we get domain groups, policies, trusts, users. I'm going to show you this because a lot of times, I would say maybe 10, 50% of the time, maybe not a lot of times, but 10 to 15% of the time, we will see descriptions with passwords in them. Like here, I put this in here just for an example, but this is kind of what the printout looks like. We've got administrators, domain guests, domain admins. We could see what's running as an admin. And if they're putting in passwords and like, especially on service accounts, we can see the passwords. We see all kinds of information here. So even without logging in, this is still very sensitive information that can be used in later attacks and be used to hopefully move vertically. All right, so let's look at what happens when a domain admin event occurs instead. Here, we're going to authenticate against LDAP again, but you could see something different happens. It says, hey, we're adding a user with a username, and you see it's all jumbled in a password. It's basically just creating a new user for us. And this user is going to be an enterprise admin. You can see it creates the user, it adds the user to an enterprise admin group, and it modifies the ACL. So this gets stealthily added in, and then you could just go log right in as the user. And you can try doing, it says secret dumps.py. You can try dumping the domain credentials or domain controllers credentials. And I'll show you some examples of that here in a second. But here is an actual assessment that we did against a hospital. And actually the last 3 that I'm going to show you were hospitals. So here's one against a hospital. We ran this, got domain admin in 5 minutes. Okay, so it modified the user. We were able to modify the ACL. It created this new user, just like you just saw. And that's one example. Here's another hospital, by the way. Not always do we get the domain admin, but sometimes we get a computer added. So sometimes you see the accounts added with just an actual admin account. Here with the same sort of scenario, another authentication happens, but instead a computer gets created. Now, even with a computer, we can log in and do some damage. Here's an example of me using a Kerberos ticket and logging in with this, just specifying a Kerberos ticket that I generated. Here's another example of using that Kerberos ticket with that computer and dumping out the local SAM hashes and the LSA and everything else involved with a specific machine, which will lead to domain controller rights as well. So very, very, very scary and not very much thought of type exploit that's out there. These are the mitigation strategies. I'm not going to cover them because they get kind of technical. Best case scenario, you disable IPv6, though that's not realistic for a lot of people, and it can have, as it says, unwanted side effects. So here's some things that you can do. This is just additional stuff if you want to go above and beyond that would go to prevent this attack, but I'm going to kind of just leave it here as I'm trying to stay a little high level today. All right, so third story is you spent how much on security? So this is a hospital, another hospital. Very deep pockets of this hospital. They had intrusion detection, intrusion prevention. They had antivirus on all devices, and they had what is called CyberArk. So if you're not familiar with CyberArk, it is a PAM tool or privilege access management tool. You could think about it as a tool trying to prevent some of the things that you're seeing, like LM&R. Basically, it's a check-in, check-out process. So you actually log in to CyberArk, you check out the credentials, especially like the domain admins and the sensitive credentials. You get a really long password that lasts for maybe 8 to 12 hours. And then that password recycles itself when you check it back in or after that expiration period. So the thought process there is the passwords are really long, they're complicated. So it takes out a lot of the man in the middle attacks. And the passwords they're always changing. So even if you do happen to get a password, it's only going to be valid for a little bit of time. So we were up against that, which eliminated a lot of the common attacks that we had. So we were still able to take it down. So let's talk about SMB Relay. So earlier we talked about LM&R poisoning, and you saw that I talked about how we could grab a hash. So we grab a hash when we're listening on LM&R. Well, instead of grabbing a hash, especially in an environment where you know you're up against CyberArk, the better idea might be to try to relay that hash. So we can try to, instead of taking it offline, we could try to relay it to another computer and say, hey, I'm this person, just trust what I'm saying. And what happens there and what needs to be, or what's a requirement there for that to happen, I should say, is that SMB signing must be disabled on the target. And by default, SMB signing is disabled on all workstations and is enabled on all servers. So this is more of a workstation attack. Windows or Microsoft is getting better at preventing this attack nowadays. However, this is still very common. I still see it in environments within the last year. So this is a relay attack, and the relayed credentials I have must be an administrator. That's not exactly true. However, you want a local administrator on that machine just because it makes it easier. So if you want to picture the scenario, what's happening is, say we have that event occurred, like that hack M scenario earlier. That person that we are intercepting their credentials, we're taking their credentials and we're passing that on to another machine. Now that second machine, that user has to be an admin on that machine as well, like a local administrator. If they're a local administrator, then they will authenticate if SMB signing is not enabled, because SMB signing is saying, hey, I'm validating you. And if there's no validation process, we can just sit in the middle and pretend all we want. And that's basically what's going to happen here. So we're just going to relay and pretend. So we're going to take this and we're going to relay credentials. So we're going to use actually similar tools to what you saw earlier. The NTLM Relay X can be used for this. There's also an SMB Relay tool. Both are great. We can relay that with the, and what is we have a shell. I use a command called dump. All that's doing is dumping out the SAM hashes. So now I have the administrator hash. I've got an admin account here, tech support accounts. I've got a bunch of stuff going on. So two things I can do with this. The first thing is I could take these offline. I could try to crack them, see how weak these passwords are. The second thing that I could do is do some password spraying inside the network. I could pass these hashes around if I wanted to. I could also pass the cracked password around if I wanted to. Either would work just fine because these are local accounts. We have an admin account down here, which is of interest, and this tech support account is of interest. So we have at this point what is considered a low level, just a low level privilege in a domain network. We have owned one machine, we have access to one machine, but we haven't gotten anywhere yet. However, if we try passing around the credentials, sure enough, they work everywhere you see the blue pwned. That is a machine that we have just now owned in the network. The password of the local account was power 10. The password was power 10. That was 7 characters of a local admin account on practically every computer. Okay, so again, everywhere you're seeing this, we're owning in the network. So within a few minutes, all we have to do is bounce around here, go machine to machine, dump out credentials, see if we find something new. It didn't work right directly on the domain controller, but if you have enough access to all these machines, chances are you're going to find a hash or something lying around that will allow you to get domain controller access. Didn't take long. We were able to grab a hash, use that hash to log in. Again, we don't have to crack a hash. All we have to do is have the hash to log in locally. We're authority system on a domain controller, and that's game over for that. So really the lesson learned here is that you can have spent, and they were doing so many things right, millions of dollars on security. They had all the best protections in the world, but if your local passwords, if your local accounts are using weak passwords, again, the weak password thing, right? That's bad. SMB signing should be enabled on all devices. Least privilege and account tiering. Basically, your users should not have admin rights. If your users are having admin rights, things like this happen, especially if a user has admin rights on multiple machines. And when we're talking about account tiering, if Bob's a domain admin, Bob should have a Bob account, and then Bob should have like a Bob-DA account or Bob-ADM account or something that Bob only uses when he is going to log into the domain controller and nothing else. But again, here, SMB signing led to getting onto a machine. That machine dumped a credential. That credential worked everywhere, allowed all kinds of access, which eventually led directly to a domain controller, and easy win. All right, so the last one is called Digging Deep. So this is another large hospital. They had no LMNR. IPv6 was disabled. It was a patched environment. Okay, so they had been through a pen test before. And when somebody's been through a pen test or two and they've got their stuff together, it makes it a little bit more difficult. And basically, we were between a rock and a hard place where I was looking around the network. I didn't see any glaring vulnerabilities because it was patched. So the next thing that I like to do if I'm in a network and I'm kind of up against the walls, I like to look around at websites. So I'll poke the network and see where traffic is going or where I can access on 80 or 443. And if I can get to any internal websites, I'll do that. So going around and seeing what was out there, all of their websites, by the way, did not have any default credentials. Default credentials on websites can easily lead to domain access as well, or domain controller access. I've seen it happen with printers, all kinds of stuff, leaking credentials out there. So they were doing a good job too, but they did leave one thing unauthenticated. They were demoing a new tool. And this tool that they were demoing had a security profile here with a password set, and the password was in clear text in the tool. Don't know why, but I found the password. So I didn't know exactly what the password was, if it was anywhere. So basically, I had to use this password and just start kind of guessing. And I said, you know what? Certainly, they wouldn't reuse something like that. But of course, you try it as administrator, and of course, they did reuse it. Once they reused it, once we're on a machine, it's just moving machine to machine, trying to figure out what we can do. So what we do here is, again, we dump the creds now that we're logged into the machine. Get in there, dump the creds. We have an administrator account and we have an admin account. And I left this part out right here to show you that these were the same password. Okay. And again, we don't have to crack a password. We just have to have the hash. Now, if we crack it, bonus points, but we don't have to crack it. From here, we take the password and we log in, and we're authority system on a machine, start going around, going box to box wherever we can. And what happens is some of these boxes were actually Windows 7 boxes. Windows 7 has this lovely feature called WDigest. WDigest, lovely feature that stores credentials in clear text. So you bounce around enough machines, you find a service account called IS Setup, you find a fairly strong password, not too bad. But again, if it's in clear text, your password's no good. And we take that and we can use that to log into the domain controller. So again, another network that goes down, even though it was well patched, even though they had been through a pen test, that just shows you that one small mistake, one tiny default credential on a website can lead to a mountain of mistakes and compile that all together. Had we not found that credential, I mean, we wouldn't have been able to, and it was not like a weak credential by any means. I blurred it out, but it was fairly strong. But taking that and able to log into other accounts and other credentials, and that just leads to the next thing. So it's more of that thinking outside the box. And when your back's up against the wall, what are you going to do next? That could have prevented us, even though there were other issues within the network that led to it. That initial foothold was, if it wouldn't been there, I don't know if we would have ever gotten domain controller access on that pen test. So lessons learned: no default creds, please, on your web servers, on anything. Just change your default passwords. Turn off WDigest, or upgrade from Windows 7. WDigest again puts it in clear text. You can turn this off. This is fixed in Windows 10. Okay, and don't give service accounts domain admin access. I see a lot of companies do that, especially because we can do what's called Kerber roasting. I'm not going to go too much into it, but basically, if we have a valid account, a valid domain account, we can pull down hashes from service accounts. And if your service accounts have weak passwords, we can utilize those to log into the domain controller if they're a domain admin. So please don't give your domain or your service account domain admin access, and then don't reuse passwords. You should have a unique admin password for every machine, as much as a pain that could be. We saw with a couple of stories here that local passwords will kill you. You can have the best domain security that you want, but if you have bad local passwords, it's just as bad. And that is the end of the presentation. That's all I got for you.
Thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions?
I do. I guess it's an observation I have. I'm not a pen tester, not a red teamer, but just an observation having defended networks. And by the way, Heath, I commented this, some of these ought to terrify many of us. But I wanted to focus in on the second story that you spoke about, speaking about IPv6. And as I've started to wrap my head around vulnerability management, one of the things that I found is, and I know it's a best practice, don't turn off unnecessary services. But I've also found that sometimes on networks, the most vulnerable boxes, the ones running out of date Java, out of date Flash, come on, it's 2021, who's running Flash anymore? But those are usually the same machines that have lots of unnecessary services turned on. So I wanted to ask, do you find that enabled but unnecessary services being turned on is one of your biggest open doors as a pen tester?
It can be. Usually I wouldn't say top 5, but I mean, I think that kind of ties into Kerber roasting a little bit. If you're talking about service accounts, if you're just talking about services in general, like open on ports, it can be. We still see, I mean, to this day, we still see a lot of eternal blue because people won't patch certain servers. Like there's some companies utilizing machines that they can't upgrade, and you have certain exploits that are just out there. So yeah, I mean, and it goes back to the inside outside references earlier. The outside of the house, again, you've got secure locks everywhere, but when you get inside, you might not even have locks on your doors. Some houses have those little push pin locks. I mean, so the chances when you get inside that there's a weak environment. And yeah, there's occasionally we'll see environments like that where there's just no patching going on, and or they feel like they can't patch or they can't do anything about some of the machines that they have in their environment.
Awesome, thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions while we have him? Be a good time to ask.
I just had a quick question. What was the tool? I think you were using man in the middle 6 to do the IPv6 attack. Is that the tool you were using?
Correct. It's a MITM6.
MITM6. Is there any issue testing that in a production environment?
Wouldn't test it in production.
Okay.
It can cause slowdowns.
Okay.
So my advice to you is if you do want to test it in production, I would test it at like 5-minute intervals. Maybe try to trigger something on your own, like boot up a machine and log into it kind of deal.
Okay.
And just like, because it can, if you leave it up and you're just clogging the DNS traffic, yeah, you can cause issues.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.